Right guys, so we're going to talk through some of the variables at play during the flat barbell bench press. So this is an important one to kind of, really think about what your client's goal actually is, okay? Because if your client's goal is, come into the gym, general health, maybe build a bit of muscle, a bit of strength, but kind of nothing too serious, you mightn't be as concerned with some of the variables as you might be for someone like a powerlifter. So if you think about the goal for client number one, I want to look a bit better, I want to feel healthier, and that's about it, then we don't necessarily need to think, okay, we need to put in all the variables in place so the performance is maximal. However, in the case of a powerlifter, we have to think about what's going to allow for performance, and that's kind of it. Because all we're thinking about is how can you move the maximum amount of weight from point A to point B. So you always have to try to remember that the flat barbell bench press is an exercise that is basically extracted from the sport of powerlifting, and hence most people are going to think they need to perform it like a powerlifter. And while that's a totally valid approach, the two don't necessarily translate perfectly together. So what I'm going to do here is basically take you through the general way that you might perform a bench press, some of the kind of amendments that you can make to really try to maximize performance. So if you're trying to move the most amount of weight and that's your sole goal, some of the things that you can do for that, and then some of the adjustments you can make for individuals who, maybe they're injured or they want to really focus on chest hypertrophy and they're not feeling it at the moment, or something along those lines. So to start off with, Paddy, I want you to show me kind of your normal bench press, really, just to start off with, and then we'll kind of talk through what's going on. So what Paddy's doing here is that he's putting his feet way back under him, okay? This is something you're going to find with some clients, and maybe yourself, that's actually a more comfortable position. So this bench, and most benches, will have a fixed height. So if you bring your leg out in front again, Paddy, as you were, what you'll see is that the length of Paddy's lower leg, right? So if it's straight pointing towards the ceiling, it's actually much higher than the height of the bench itself. So this is where things like your segment lengths do become important. So because that is so long there for a tall individual, we're in a position where this is now above his bum, and hence as he begins to use any sort of leg drive, there's going to be a big tendency for that bum basically to come up off the bench, So if we're going to keep that down, we're going to use his feet in under him this time. So that's his more comfortable position. So as he kind of pushes here now, he feels way more supported. So his bum isn't going to become way up off the bench anymore. So that's just something that you might find is comfortable for yourself or for some of your clients, and there's nothing necessarily bad about that. The only point that would be worth noting here is that some powerlifting federations, if you are coaching powerlifters, don't allow the heels to be off the floor, so you might have to keep them out in front. But in general, your goal with the lower body setup is to find a way that you can basically feel really stable on the bench. And if you're trying to really maximize strength output, your goal is then to be able to transfer force from the lower body to the upper body. Because as Paddy pushes with his legs here, he's actually reinforcing the stability in the upper back, because this is basically one big force transmitter. So as he tries to extend the knees, the lower body is pushing into the upper back. And then that's basically allowing for more stability up there. But in general, for most clients, you want the lower body to be stable anyway, so that's what you're looking for. As well as that, we want the glutes to be tight. That's one of the cues I give to a lot of clients that they're not aware of, is keeping the glutes tight. Imagine you're doing a hip thrust and you're in that top position. We also want, in general, like for most clients, I want that lower back to be nice and arched. This is quite a large arch that Paddy has here, because again, this is what's going to allow us to maximize actual weight that's being moved. So what I want to show here is, if you flatten out here, Paddy, right? If he flattens out there, that changes the actual mechanics of the exercise. So one, really important for kind of from a powerlifting perspective, if you're maximizing strength, is that because his chest is flatter now, he's taken 2 or 3 inches off the bottom position of the exercise. So that's something that's worth thinking about, guys, is that you hear a lot of talk, about full range of motion, but what full range of motion means totally varies between different individuals. Because if Paddy arches again, there's a huge difference in height there. Like, that's inches that you're talking about, especially if you're talking about, you know, a powerlifter who's going to try and choose the highest point. So he can bring it there to his lower sternum. Like, if you bring the bar out and touch it as low as you can there, you know, that's still so far away from his shoulder joint. We've got a distance of that much away from the shoulder joint between the bar and the shoulder. Whereas if you flatten out again for me, Paddy, especially if the shoulders aren't back, you know, we've got this small distance now between the actual bar and the shoulder joint. And what you'll find is that, you can put the bar back again, that's fine. What you'll find is that, particularly with highly trained individuals who maybe were genetically gifted for the bench press, they'll actually have intrinsic characteristics and trained characteristics that make it more advantageous for them to come down and touch their chest. So what you'll see here is that there's an element of the rib cage being involved here. So if someone has a really large rib cage, and if they also have a very kind of a very pointy, not pointy, but a very inclined sternal angle in this point, right? So if we're looking at this position and Paddy's sternal angle is pointing up that way, that's basically creating a situation where we've got this big large rib cage, sternal angle is pointing up like that. So that's creating a basic body structure that is more favorable, independent of any arching of the back. So if you take someone who's got a big large rib cage, so that is already out here, and they also arch their back lots, you're going to have a very big difference between that person's range of motion that they're working through and the range of motion of maybe a brand new trainee who's, you know, quite skinny, or, you know, some individuals have really narrow rib cages, and some people can even have genetic variation that leaves them with holes in their rib cage, you know. So that's something that's worth considering here, is that you could have a client that comes in day one and they're totally flat. So everything's flat. They're struggling to pinch their shoulder blades back. And if you do a rep like that and you come down to the bottom, you know, he has to work through a much larger range of motion. Look at the distance between that elbow and the shoulder there versus now if you arch up for me, totally different exercise. Like, that's fundamentally a different exercise at this point in terms of mechanics. So you can put the weight back again. So basically, we're not talking about good or bad here. We're just talking about that changes the range of motion that you're working with, and it changes the potential for you to move actual weight. So that's something that you want to be aware of. So in general, as a sound rule of thumb, we want an arch in the back, and we want to be able to pinch those shoulder blades back nice and tight. And the more oriented you are towards performance in terms of having the most weight on the bar, the more you want to try and increase that arch, and the more you want to basically make the most of reducing the range of motion. So now, with that said, some people might be thinking, okay, so, you know, that's what you want to do if you're a powerlifter, but what if you're just a general trainee? Do you want to arch your back? And the answer is generally yes, because one of the other effects that actually manifests when you start to arch your back, and especially if you have a larger rib cage, is that it also is more favorable from the perspective of your pec mechanics. Okay, so if you're able to, you know, really arch your back, if you do that again for me, Paddy, the way that this pec is now pulling, it's in a more favorable position to pull this arm across the body, because the pec is attaching from here, it's converging in onto this arm. It has a really good line of pull to be able to pull up there. So it's got more advantage than it would if you were really flat, you know, and it's just kind of pulling across there. Okay, it's not in as much of an advantageous position to produce force. So if you're able to get up into that nice arch position, it's much easier to actually start to feel those pecs working. Okay, so that's one of the things that's worth noting, is that if you have highly trained individuals and they have a large rib cage, you know, and they've already got lots of pec muscle, they might actually find it just much easier for their pecs to work immediately than someone who's, you know, maybe they come into you and their shoulders are rounded forward and they find it difficult to pull their chest back or to pull their shoulder blades back. They find it difficult to arch. They've got a small rib cage. It might be difficult for that individual to actually start involving the pecs immediately. So that might be just something to be aware of in terms of variations between clients. So as you begin to perform the exercise, let's get it going. So you get your arch going. So he's got his arch going, he's pinching the shoulder blades back. Key thing here is really getting those shoulder blades back and down, okay? So what you don't want is just to be shrugged up. So Paddy, if you shrug up for me there, the arms are moving up this way, it's a far less stable position. Whereas if we can pull those down, now he's in a stable position. Now you've got force transfer from the lower body to the upper body. We've got an upper back that's nicely stuck in position, and then he's going to unrack that bar, and then we're getting into the actual repetitions themselves. So in general, when you're starting to cue your clients, what I would start with is coming down roughly to the nipple line, okay? Potentially the lower border or the lower part of the sternum in some cases, but that's going to vary between individuals. Some people might find it easier to touch a little bit higher, and some people a little bit lower, and that's also going to vary depending on how much of an arch someone actually has as well, because as you begin to arch, that changes what's actually on top for you as you begin to bring the bar down. So with this kind of basic barbell bench press variation, some of the things that I generally try to cue my clients on are: one, keeping those knuckles towards the ceiling. So if you can keep your knuckles towards the ceiling, you get better force transfer from where the weight is resting on the base of your palm there, down through the arm. So if this begins to fold back, if you extend that, what you'll see there now is that bar, the line of force from the bar, is actually not in line with this arm at all. So what that means is that we're getting the leaking of force essentially, because as Paddy pushes, it's going to be less stable, and he's also going to be challenging these wrist flexors. So you can come back to your normal position. If you were to really start to apply a lot of force against your wrist flexors like that, if you have someone that's reporting elbow pain, sometimes that can actually be the cause, and that's not something you might immediately think of. But if you've got someone who's being pushed into wrist extension like that, that's putting tension on all the wrist flexors. And if we think back to our anatomy again, this is why anatomy is absolutely so key when thinking about exercise. All those wrist flexors attach there at the medial epicondyle, okay? So they're attaching on the inner side of the elbow. So when you've got clients who are reporting elbow pain during bench pressing, that's one of the things that I would be screening for. I'd be seeing, all right, what's their wrist position like when they're actually bench pressing? And sometimes that cueing of, all right, knuckles towards the ceiling, that can solve that kind of positioning error immediately. And if that's not the case, what you can start to do is potentially bring in some wrist wraps. So if you've got wrist wraps here, that's where that begins to reinforce that ability to keep those knuckles towards the ceiling and keep the wrists in more of a neutral position. So that's that. We've got our kind of hand positioning sorted. From there, something that everyone is going to wonder about is, how much should I be tucking? Is it bad to keep my elbows out? Should I keep my elbows all the way in? And really, there's going to be some variation here. In general, what I'm kind of looking for is somewhere between a 45 to 60 degree angle between the side of the body, so that line leading up to the axilla, and the actual angle of the upper arm, okay? So if what that actually looks like from my perspective as I look down is something like that, okay? Now, can it be okay to let the arms flare out? So let your arms flare out all the way? It can be absolutely fine, but the thing here is that when you start to get into this position, it does actually adjust your range of motion capacity as well. So if you actually put the bar back for a second, what you have to realize is that our ability to move changes with different planes. So if we have the shoulder joint, if you try and pull back for me, Paddy, with the elbows really high, it's far harder, and you'll feel that if you try that yourself behind the camera. It's far harder to pull all the way down when those elbows are way flared out, okay? So there's less range of motion capacity for extension there. So as a result, if I was trying to get Paddy to maybe do a bench press variation like that, because maybe he feels it more on the chest when we do it like that, and we can use more intent, that's a perfectly valid approach, then I would want to be aware of what his range of motion capacity is there, so that I'm not just pushing him all the way down. Because sometimes what you'll find is that people will report, when I go too wide, that it aggravates my shoulders. But it could just be the case that you want to actually just pay attention to what the range of motion capacity is. So when we bring those hands in then to more of a kind of angled approach, and you pull the hands down as far as you can, what I can see there is that he's able to come down to that chest like no problem. So he's got that range of motion available there. So if we're doing the exercise like this, I'm going to be thinking about him working through a different range of motion than if he's got the hands way flared out. And in general, when it comes to the total close grip variation then, where the elbows are tucked into the sides, that's going to be fine as well. So we can come down and use that chest as our endpoint there, okay? So again, something to be aware of when you are working with different clients is that if you do have someone who's reporting, constant shoulder pain, maybe one side, or they said, I had surgery previously, or this shoulder's always been stiff. Sometimes you can have certain types of surgeries where people will have repair of the rotator cuff or repair of the joint capsule, and they might tighten it up and they mightn't have that range of motion restored. So if I was working with an individual like that and they were telling me that this was a problem in the bench press, I might do a quick active range of motion assessment to see what kind of range of motion they can achieve, and then start to maybe apply that within the context of the exercise, and then that can help me to build more customized exercise for that individual. So that's just something that's worth being aware of. So can you bring the arms all the way out? You absolutely can. That's fine. It's not immediately going to be a problem for the shoulders or anything. I know some people will say that never go out here, but I think the problem more so that they're identifying there is that when you do go out there, you just have to pay respect to the range of motion that the individual has available. So let's do another couple of reps just to point out a couple of other variables here. So we've got our arm positioning, we've got our hand positioning and everything like that. Another thing that you might want to be aware of here is the actual bar path. So in general, if you're trying to maximize your strength, you're trying to get the most out of it, what you want to do is kind of have this diagonal bar path more or less. So Paddy's bar is starting here, but as it moves down, it's actually moving towards the lower chest. So it's not coming right up and down above the shoulders, but it's also not coming right up and down above the lower chest. So this is one of the mistakes that you will see with your clients. If you tell the client to touch their lower chest, what they can sometimes do is basically start with the bar above that position and then do it right over there. And what is important to get there is that if I look from the side here at Paddy, what I'm seeing is that his shoulder joint is here and the bar is here. So even in that top position, he's working with 4 to 6 inches of a shoulder flexion moment arm there, because that weight is out in front of the shoulder. So it's almost like doing a really light front raise along with doing the actual bench press itself. So if you can keep the bar above here, above the shoulder joint when you're back in the top position, and then lower when you're down in the bottom position, and then pushing back and up as you go back up, that's a more efficient path of movement that minimizes kind of any wasted energy just trying to hold the bar in place. So that's something that can apply to both your kind of powerlifting or strength focused individual and the person who's just kind of training for general hypertrophy, general health or whatever, because you don't want the individual to feel like, oh, they can't even hold the bar in the top position. So there's some of the key points, guys, that I would be keeping in mind when I'm starting to program a bench press.